Okay, so let's take a look at one example of a controlled process, and that would be this concept or this idea of willpower. Now that's sort of a layman's term for that experience that we have where we have to sort of resist some other temptation. It's often experienced as aversive. It's not sort of a nice feeling if we have to resist some temptation. Now, what is it we're resisting? Often some kind of viscerally motivated behavior. Well, what would be an example? Let's say you've been, on a workout routine and you're trying to exercise and stay healthy, but you're at dinner and you get the dessert tray and there's this amazing chocolate cake or whatever, and your emotional systems, right, your desire gets cranked into high gear and you just want that cake, right? Now, the emotional systems send a powerful signal to your decision-making systems. Eat the cake. It takes significant willpower to resist those visceral urges. Now, what is it that's sort of controlling or regulating the exercise of willpower? Well, we might say you might have some higher level goals that are stored. You've told yourself, you've decided that you're going to reduce the cake and you're going to get in shape, right? And so these high level goals then are systems that are going to then activate these frontal lobe systems to resist the signals from your emotional systems. So we've got a brain that is internally conflicted. Some parts of the brain are saying eat the cake. Other parts of the brain are saying don't eat the cake. And that tension is experienced as an aversive experience. It takes effort, right, to resist the temptation to eat the cake. And if we think from a sort of an evolutionary point of view, what is it that these emotional signals sort of are representing? What's their sort of survival effect on the human? Well, what these strong emotions tend to do is to shorten the time horizon for decision making, right? So the now becomes the preference. Now becomes more important than the later. The willpower systems, right, the frontal lobe systems, we were talking about having a goal, a high-level goal. Well, we can think of that as sort of a longer-term goal. And if you think of it that way, then the willpower systems, the executive systems, are representing longer-term goals, and those are in conflict with short-term goals represented by the emotional systems. And so when we say that somebody has self-control, we can describe that as, well, their willpower is strong. Of course, that's sort of just a pop psychology way of describing it. Or that the systems that represent long-term goals are stronger, relatively stronger than others, so that those systems are able to resist the emotional signals, the temptations of the chocolate cake. So when we say some people have strong willpower, some people have weak willpower, then we're sort of making a distinction between those whose executive systems are more effective at resisting temptation and those whose executive systems are less effective at resisting temptations. But why is it hard for most of us to resist these temptations? And this will be another sort of cartoon explanation for that. Now, these elements here represent, again, nerve cells. So we've got the cell body, the axon, the terminal, and so on. And we're talking about these two systems. The cognitive systems would be our frontal lobe systems, executive control systems. And the emotional systems, they would be the ones that are signaling eat the cake, right? Our desires, our emotional systems. What researchers have found, neuroanatomists have found, that the connectivity between these two systems is not balanced. In other words, the emotional systems have more inputs into the cognitive systems than the cognitive systems have to the emotional systems. So there's an imbalance in the connectivity. There's a sort of a stronger connection, you might say, that the emotional systems have on the cognitive systems than vice versa. And so we are in a situation where our immediate temptations, our urges, our impulses, our current emotional states have significant influence on the decision-making systems. It takes significant willpower, right, to resist the input from those emotional systems. And it's difficult for all of us because, relatively speaking, the emotional systems have greater influence on the cognitive systems than vice versa. But this also points to some potential sources of variation between individuals. Some of us might have relatively more cognitive control over our emotional systems. Some of us might have relatively less cognitive control over the emotional systems. Now you might ask, well, why are brains hooked up like this? I mean, why give preferential influence to the emotional systems and not the cognitive systems? Aren't we supposed to be the thinking species and, that type of thing? Well, from an evolutionary perspective, it might make sense that our emotional systems have relatively more say. We can think of the emotions as guiding our behavior in adaptive ways. And if we think about the now becoming the preference over the future, over the later, in our ancestral past, it was less certain that there was going to be a future, that there was going to be a later. And so from an evolutionary point of view, natural selection may have favored systems that give a bit more preference to the now, especially if the things that we're seeking, the things that are valuable to us, like sugar, as a basic nutrient, especially if those types of things were critical to survival and they weren't as plentiful as they are now in modern society. So in the past, if you came along some good sugar source, right, it might have really been adaptive for you to consume it when you can. But nowadays, we live in an environment where sugar is all over the place. We can get it any time we want. And so these emotional systems having more power, relatively more power than the cognitive systems, that might be a disadvantage for us in a different environment, in our modern environment. So for us, every time we open the refrigerator, we are tempted, right? Our emotional systems kick into gear. But in the past, we wouldn't have had such frequent temptations. And it might have been adaptive for us to have emotional systems that were a little bit more powerful than the cognitive systems.